It is a new week on A to Z Sports Cincinnati. I'm John Sheeran, covering your Cincinnati Bengals, one of two AFC teams to have not fired their head coach since the end of the 2022 season. Kind of mind-blowing. Obviously, the only other team in that list is the Kansas City Chiefs. Kind of makes sense a little bit, considering that the Bengals are one of only two AFC teams to represent the conference in the Super Bowl. Kind of speaks to how this coaching cycle has kind of gone down, not just this year, but in recent years. Bengals obviously being ultra conservative, Chiefs being the dynasty on basically the end of their dynasty. But that's just a side note. We're going to get to some other things on tonight's show. It might not be that long of a show compared to recent weeks, but we'll get you covered with everything that is worth going on in Bengals land. If you're on TikTok, what's up? Join the YouTube chat so I can see your comments and questions. We already got some coming in about the topic of the night from Mike Gets You Moving. Brian Callahan coming back, ? We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But like I said, this is A to Z Sports Cincinnati. I'm John Sheeran, streaming everywhere from YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, wherever you get your Bengals content on your phone, whatever the case may be. A to Z Sports Cincinnati is your place. So, I guess let's get to the somewhat Bengals news of the week, which is Bengals head coach Zac Taylor is now allowing offensive coordinator Dan Pitcher to interview with other teams in need of a play-calling offensive coordinator. Now, this news was broken by NFL Media's Ian Rappaport. He does have a good connection with the Bengals. And there were questions about the framing of this news, whether or not it's a PR spin done by the Bengals, what the actual technicalities in terms of a head coach blocking or not being able to block an interview from his assistant, taking a lateral move that's not technically a lateral move. There's a lot of nuances here. But the basic facts is Dan Pitcher has been the offensive coordinator for the Bengals since 2024. He does not call plays, but in every other sense of the word, he is a central architect for what the Bengals do offensively. And obviously, the Bengals offense is their crowning jewel of their team because the defense is terrible. He's been there for 2 years, but he's been with the Bengals a lot longer than that. And I feel like to really go through the dynamics of this story that is evolving, it's ongoing, and it could honestly conclude at any moment, even during the stream, we have to go back to when Dan Pitcher was first hired by the Bengals, which was not by Zac Taylor. Dan Pitcher has been with the Bengals since 2016. He was a Marvin Lewis hire, fresh off of them going to 5 consecutive playoff appearances in the early 2010s. And he was a scout for the Indianapolis Colts before that, so he came from that part of the NFL world into becoming an assistant coach for the Bengals offense. He was an assistant wide receivers coach. He was helping out with the quarterbacks during the last couple of years of Marvin Lewis's run there. Marvin Lewis gets fired, and Zac Taylor keeps Pitcher as one of a handful of holdovers from Marvin Lewis's original staff. Darren Simmons is the obvious name there among that group. He's been with the team since 2003. I think he was one of the first hires that Marvin Lewis made. He might actually predate Marvin Lewis. I might have to fact check that after the stream here. But Dan Pitcher is now the second longest tenured coach on the Bengals staff. He's been under 2 Bengals head coaches, and they've only had 3 this century. So Dan Pitcher was obviously tabbed as a valuable asset to the coaching staff under Zac Taylor in his original coaching staff, and he became Joe Burrow's first quarterback coach in 2020. He was the quarterback's coach in 2019 as well. So naturally, Pitcher becomes important in terms of Joe Burrow's development in his very early years, and as Burrow progresses, so does Dan Pitcher coaching him, leading that room. He starts to gain more influence in the offense, starts to have a greater responsibility with their operations. And as the Bengals offense is getting better and it's growing with Brian Callahan as its offensive coordinator, Brian Callahan, obviously the first offensive coordinator under Zac Taylor, hired in 2019, obviously things start to get moving a little bit. And 2021 happens, they go to the Super Bowl, 2022 happens, the offense remains stable, remains great. And naturally there's a conversation about, okay, well, let's think about the future here, because the good thing about what the Bengals have going on is that their head coach. When the offense is good, right, and the team is good, the head coach, Zach Taylor, is one calling the plays. So there's no one looking to restart their franchise that can poach Zach Taylor. Again, when things are going well, there's no one who can poach him away, and the Bengals lose the mastermind, the play caller of their offense. That's the beauty of the system that they have, and it's why they wanted Zach Taylor to call plays in the first place. But they knew that also that they could still lose offensive coordinators in this process if the offense is good. It doesn't happen after 2022. But Dan Pitcher, again, who's the quarterback's coach at this point in time, he gets a look to be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offensive coordinator in the 2023 offseason, fresh off the 2022 season, fresh off of them obviously, going to the AFC Championship game, losing to the Chiefs. The Bengals end up giving Dan Pitcher a pretty significant raise, and what was believed at the time to be like an under-the-table handshake deal that when Brian Callahan, not if, but when Brian Callahan moves on to become a head coach, you're going to be the next guy. You're going to be the offensive coordinator here under Zach Taylor, and you're going to complete this ascension from low-level assistant to arguably the second or third most important coach on the staff. And that's essentially what happened, because in 2023, Joe Burrow obviously has the calf strain. He ends up, breaking his wrist, yada, yada, yada. And when he goes out and Jake Browning plays decently well in those first handful of weeks, people start to notice that, okay, like Joe Burrow is obviously great, but there is something to this Bengals offense in which, like, a backup quarterback in Jake Browning, who's never really played any significant time in his life in the NFL, he starts to produce well. And that's what gets Brian Callahan a head coaching opportunity in the first place with the Tennessee Titans. They obviously want someone with, to move on from Mike Vrabel. They want like a fresh offensive mind. Callahan, obviously his dad, Bill Callahan, is one of the greatest assistant coaches in the history of the NFL, who was a head coach and an offensive mastermind in his own mark in college. So they think that, the son of Bill Callahan is going to do them some wonders there. And Brian Callahan leaves the Bengals. Dan Pitcher at the time, again, he's still like the quarterback's coach, and he gets offered to be the New Orleans Saints offensive coordinator at the time. And with that role comes play calling opportunities. It's a play calling offensive coordinator role, I think, under the last year of Dennis Allen, who was the head coach at the time. Dennis Allen obviously being a defensive minded coach. He was a former defensive coordinator, now the defensive coordinator for the Chicago Bears. Dan Pitcher decides to stay with the Bengals, to not call plays, but to now be this offensive coordinator for the Cincinnati Bengals, the offensive coordinator for the offense that Joe Burrow runs. And if Brian Callahan can get a head coaching opportunity in this role, then maybe Dan Pitcher can as well. Someone who, again, has risen through the ranks, has grown in responsibility. He's even helping out with the analytics department at this point, which, again, is not exactly where it probably should be compared to NFL standards, but they need all the help they can get. And Dan Pitcher has been a part of that, along with Sam Francis, who's like the head of their analytics department. So Dan Pitcher becomes the Bengals offensive coordinator, but again, just like Brian Callahan, he's not the one calling plays. 2 years go by now. Dan Pitcher last offseason doesn't get any looks to be an offensive coordinator for another team or a head coach at all, right? Despite the Bengals offense looking pretty damn well in 2024. Another year passes. There's a lot more head coaching opportunities now. There's a total of 10 that have opened up this offseason. Now 4 have been filled. Dan Pitcher gets an interview to become the Cleveland Browns head coach, but nothing really happens from that. And now, doesn't look like Dan Pitcher is going to be the head coach of the Browns. He's basically been eliminated from that conversation. But Zach Taylor allows Dan Pitcher to interview with other teams to be their offensive play caller, to be their offensive coordinator with play calling duties. And it really begs the question, why is he doing this now? Like, what is the reason? And I think back to the beginning of the offseason, in which Zach Taylor is, asking or answering questions about his coaching staff, and he says he doesn't expect to make any changes. And I think he was entirely truthful when he said that in the first week of January. But clearly, something has changed at least a little bit within that building. And the one part that I missed out on the timeline here is that Brian Callahan gets fired by the Tennessee Titans in the beginning of October. He spent some time with his family. He's not in the coaching ranks. He's been available to hire by anyone since October, but I don't think he's really been putting himself out there until this month, in which he gets interviewed by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the beginning of the month, and then by the Los Angeles Chargers last week. Now Brian Callahan is getting a second interview to be the OC of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which, by the way, that's where Liam Cohen came from. That's where Dave Canales came from. I believe there's another one that I'm missing there, but it's been a recent hotbed in terms of offensive coordinators becoming head coaches. Naturally, I think either Brian Callahan or Dan Pitcher would love the opportunity to become a head coach. And if that is a place in which that can happen, obviously Callahan already did that with the Bengals, but it didn't work out well. He landed in a bad spot, and it was a disaster in Tennessee. But it makes sense as to why any aspiring head coach would want to springboard his career with the Buccaneers. The important thing here is the Bengals can block this. Zach Taylor can block this, right? I think it's technically it's in my eyes, it's technically a promotion when you go from an offensive coordinator who doesn't call plays to an offensive coordinator who does call plays, because it matters so much in terms of the hiring process. It's like, hey, like this is your scheme. These are your decisions that is manufacturing this offense. And if this offense is successful, then that's something that we want a part of. We want you now to lead the team, and we want to put you in the highest position so that nobody can poach you, nobody can hire away from you, no one else can promote you. Like, we want that, right? And that matters so much. But Dan Pitcher becoming the offensive coordinator for the Bucs is still a lateral move, right? Like, it's still something that the Bengals can prevent from happening. And again, the framing of that news that Zach Taylor is now allowing it to happen is the most interesting part here. And I think by this time, a lot of people have put it together that there has to be a reason why Zach Taylor would allow that. And the clearest reason is because I think Zach Taylor and the Bengals will be okay losing Dan Pitcher if it means that they can get Brian Callahan back. The timing of this is still interesting to me, though, because Brian Callahan, again, has been available since October, right? He didn't just get fired at the beginning or the middle of January. He didn't just become Sean McDermott a couple of days ago, and all of a sudden he's back on the market, and then the Bengals have to change their plans here. I really don't know why, like, this is now becoming a thing. I think Zach could have done this immediately, or when offensive coordinator gigs first started becoming open, right? The Chargers fired Greg Roman after the divisional round. The Lions fired their head coach, I think, at the end of the season. I don't really know when the Bucs gig opened up anyways, but it just kind of came out of nowhere. And I don't know if like more conversations have happened within the building about, hey, like, do we actually prefer Callahan coming back if we can get him back, on top of doing Dan Pitcher a solid and giving him the chance to add play calling duties to his resume as a potential head coach? I think that can be part of it. I've never questioned the quality of the person that Zach Taylor is and how much he does care genuinely about his fellow coaches and his assistants. He definitely knows that he can't do this job alone, and he leans so much on his top assistants. And again, Dan Pitcher is someone who has grown from being a low-level assistant to being in the hierarchy of that staff. And I think he definitely appreciates who Dan Pitcher is and how much help that he provides for him as one of the architects of that offense. The offense does not make the developments over the past couple of years without Dan Pitcher's influence. Jamar Chase being moved around into the slot. I think certain evolutions with their under center passing game and their under center running game, all of that can be attributed to Dan Pitcher. Dan Pitcher was so integral in basically just elevating Jake Browning as a starter. Like, all those on the fly adjustments that the offense made, like, a lot of that was influenced by Dan Pitcher, who was the quarterback's coach at the time. Dan Pitcher has meant a lot to this team over the past few years, and it would be a detrimental blow if he were to leave to become the Cleveland Browns head coach or to become the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense coordinator, right? And it looks like that at least the latter appears to be a realistic opportunity for him. And again, I think this is like a bad move by the Bengals if they were to allow this to happen. Obviously, it comes off as kind of a dick move, be like, nah, like you need to stay here. Like, we don't want you advancing your career. In terms of like what can allow him to be a head coach, but it does seem like Zach, at the very least, is very comfortable with the idea of bringing back Brian Callahan. And for people who are asking, why would the Bengals, bring back Brian Callahan? And if play calling duties are on the table for Brian Callahan, I wouldn't say that's the case. If play calling duties aren't on the table for Dan Pitcher, and you would have to imagine that they aren't, because if you're allowing him to leave to become a play caller, then that implies that he can't be a play caller here. So there's no way that you would give Brian Callahan play calling duties after he just came back from his failure as a head coach, as an offensive head coach, an offensive play caller, if you will. It doesn't seem to be on the table. And I think the reason why Brian Callahan is now like center stage with this is because a lot of what went into bringing back Al Golden last year. Like, Zach knew that he needed to get the defensive coordinator hire right, because if it blew up in his face, which it kind of did, right? And that's why we even talked about Zach being fired at the end of 2025 or leading up to the end of 2025, because if that decision was wrong, then it looks terrible in his face and he just blew another year with Joe Burrow. But he hired Al Golden because he knew him and he trusted him to identify what was wrong with the defense and to get it right. Trust is the key word here. Zach needs as many guys on his staff that he trusts. He is not going to give this job, if it does open up, if Dan Pitcher does leave, he's not going to hire an external guy. He's not going to hire Mike McDaniel. He's not going to hire anyone else from the outside coming into the system and bringing in new ideas. He's not going to do any of that. As much as I think the Bengals would benefit a lot of times under those circumstances, it can't be this year for him. Because he knows that if 2026, again, is a flop like it was last year, the excuses at that point are just, they're non-existent. So, of course, the offensive coordinator who was a part of 5 playoff wins in the early part of this decade, who was a part of the rise of this offense, who knows Joe Burrow very well, who knows T. Higgins, Jamar Chase very well, and can obviously adapt and learn about what adjustments have been made in the past couple of years, that is the simplest transition that doesn't involve just basically promoting someone internally. Because the obvious, I think, internal promotion would be Brad Crackthorpe, who's the quarterback's coach, right? He took over for Dan Pitcher when Dan Pitcher was promoted in 2024. Crackthorpe was with Joe Burrow in LSU in 2018, and like that just made honestly drafting Joe Burrow even more obvious, because you bring in a guy from LSU in that coaching staff who has obvious familiarity, and now Crackthorpe has been working with Burrow for the past handful of years now. So that's another, like the Bengals have promoted quarterbacks coaches to offensive coordinators several times in the last decade now. That's just the natural progression if that were to be the case. And that probably would be the case if Brian Callahan was still coaching the Tennessee Titans, but he's not. So Zach Taylor sees his original offensive coordinator, who worked with him for 5 years, who knows that when he was here, the offense was good, and it did evolve. It did develop into something that was sustainable. It improved, I think, with Dan Pitcher. But again, I don't think that Pitcher leaving means that everything is going to revert back to where it was before he took over, or before he got that promotion. I think that there are certain things that can overlap into 2026 if Pitcher were to leave. And obviously, all of this is hypothetical, right? We don't know if Dan Pitcher is going to be hired by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We don't know if he's got other opportunities lined up. It is just interesting, though, that Zach would allow this 3 weeks into the offseason after saying that he doesn't expect to make any coaching changes. The fact that Brian Callahan has been out there for this entire time, I don't necessarily know what changed. I don't know if Dan went to Zach and said, hey, like, I really want this opportunity. I really want to see if I can get this. And Zach is like, okay, like we're going to allow this just because Callahan is available for us to hire if we want him to, if we want him back. But that's kind of what to expect at this point. Either Dan Pitcher is the offensive coordinator for 2026, and then maybe he gets more head coaching opportunities in the 2027 offseason if the offense remains good, or Dan Pitcher leaves to become the Bucs offensive coordinator or some other offensive coordinator for a team that needs an offensive play caller. And if Brian Callahan is available, he's coming back. And if neither one, if Callahan gets hired by Los Angeles and Dan Pitcher gets hired by Tampa Bay, then I guess it's Crackthorpe. And Zach completely mismanaged this, and it might just be one of the final blows in terms of this whole thing falling apart. That's how important this next week and a half is. How important it could be for the future of this offense, right? Because if Joe Burrow is still there, and the offense is healthy, then it's going to be competitive, right? That's why I don't think many people are necessarily freaking out about this. This is why I read a lot of the comments talking about this over the past couple of days, saying that, yeah, if Zach Taylor's still the play caller, then like how much does this really matter? And that's how much people think about the play caller in this instance. But I'm telling you, from what I know and from what I've heard, pitcher's influence has been instrumental in how much this offense has grown over the past couple of years. And just losing smart coaches in general is not the greatest thing for your team in general. So I hope that Dan Pitcher stays in Cincinnati for as long as possible. And yeah, if there was even one head coach, if there was even one coach on this team that I would be totally okay with if they were to get promoted to take over for Zach, Dan would be probably the guy. I really do think that highly of him, and I think a lot of Bengals fans should follow suit. We're going to get to some comments here in a couple minutes, but I did want to touch on what happened last night and the lower level of the NFL light, if you will now. The College Football Playoff National Championship was a lot of fun, and I think a lot of people were hoping that it wasn't going to be a blowout like Indiana did to Ohio State, like they did to Oregon, where they won by a combined like 71 points or something like that. Miami made it competitive, and I really hope that they would because of how strong Miami is in the trenches, even though that Indiana basically rarely lost a battle in the trenches last night. Like, yeah, Miami had like that one big run by Fletcher that swung the momentum back in their way a little bit, but Miami made a lot of crucial mistakes, especially on third down. They had a punt blocked, and Indiana's run game was simply better when it needed to be, and that's why they stayed ahead for the entire game. I think it was one of the only times in championship history in which the winning team did not trail all game. Even 2020 LSU were down by like 10 to Clemson at one point, and then obviously Burrow and company rolled away against a really, really good Clemson team at the time. But it was fun seeing Indiana kind of do that. But it was also a great opportunity for a lot of draft prospects to really make their final stamp, make their final case, put the last 60 minutes of tape out there for all of us to see. And these guys were in the spotlight under the brightest lights. And my God, if Ruben Bain is there at 10th overall, I think every Bengals fan is going to be pounding the table for him. Ruben Bain is a ton of fun to watch. It's fun trying to compare him to an NFL player because of how short, stout, and kind of T-Rexy arms he's got. I've seen Tom Bahali. I've seen Brandon Graham. I don't really know. I don't really have one at this moment. I just know that the guy produces and the guy wins quickly. The guy wins with a clear and cohesive plan as a pass rusher. He's got power. He's got bend. He's got get off. Everything in terms of the eye test, he passes. In terms of the production and the production that translates to the next level, he's got. And yeah, I think last night was a great opportunity for Bengals fans who may not be entirely familiar with who Ruben Bain is. They're familiar now. And he's not the only one on the Miami defensive line. Akeem Mesidor on the other side of the formation had a really good game as well. He's a little bit older. I think he's going to be 25 by the time the draft starts, but also really productive. And if he falls to the second round, which at this point might be unlikely, I think just being that productive and being that successful on a team that successful, it kind of boosts your draft stock a little bit. But either one, I think, would be great fits for what the Bengals defensive line needs. The defensive tackle, his first name is Antoine. I forget his last name. There's been some talk about him as well. Really disruptive. Quick twitch guy at like 320 pounds. Doesn't sound like he's going to be declaring for the draft, though. He's still an underclassman, and there's some rumblings that he's going to come back and run it back with Miami, which is, I mean, we're in the third week of January, and technically, like, the window for these guys to declare is still open. The guys who actually played in the championship game, and this is, I think, the latest that it's ever really been. So by this point, like, you kind of already know who's going to be in the draft and who isn't going to be in the draft, but we don't know for some of these guys. But Ruben Bain, who is, I believe, an underclassman as well, he's pretty much a lock for the top 10 at this point, I would think. I think he's just played too well in these games when teams are really turning towards the draft now. He's made phenomenal first impressions to these scouting departments and to these teams drafting in the top 10, and pass rushers are always going to go early when there's good ones available, especially in a class that doesn't, I mean, we say this every year, right? There's only going to be 12 or 13 true first-round players, and that's no different this year. So the Bengals are right at the precipice of potentially falling off and entering that next tier of players. But I think Ruben Bain is safely in that top tier. And it's just about how afraid our team's going to be of his arm length. A to Z Sports has confirmed that his arms are going to be under 32 inches and potentially even smaller than that. We're going to get measurements officially at the scouting combine in about a month's time. And teams really do care about that. If they feel like he doesn't have the length to do what he has done in college against NFL offensive tackles, if they feel like he has to move inside more times than not to be successful as a pass rusher, that does affect things. And it turns what probably should be a top 5 pick into maybe the 15th pick, right? Players fall inexplicably all the time because of very, albeit archaic and subjective reasons. And arm length is definitely one of them for pass rushers. It's pass rushers and offensive tackles, or offensive tackles that are viewed as guards, right? All it takes is one team to really disregard all that, but it is a reason why players can fall. And I think that's why Ruben Bain will be in the conversation for the Bengals leading up to the draft, really. And unless he tests insanely at the combine where he's an undeniable top 5 talent or top 5 prospect at that point, I think he's going to be in the conversation for this entire pre-draft process. And you're going to see his name very much often over these next 3 months. It's just a matter of, do the Bengals address pass rush enough in free agency where they can bypass one of the best ones in the draft? Is his arm length actually that short that's going to make him fall even further? And do the Bengals actually care about that? Will they care about that when the time comes? Paul Dehner Jr. mentioned over Twitter today that the 2 players with the most sacks over the last 15 years with arm lengths under 32 inches are Geno Atkins and Trey Hendrickson. And I did forget that Trey's arm length is not that long, right? He's 6'4", 270, right? So naturally you think that he's got pretty average length, but he's got kind of short arms. The Bengals are a team that have obviously seen the very best of why that sometimes doesn't matter. It's often been the case with cornerbacks as well. A lot of their cornerbacks have kind of had shorter arms. Like DJ Turner is a good example. Darqueze Dennard didn't have the greatest arm length. So arm length doesn't really seem to be something that the Bengals really care about. If you have the size to set an edge as an even front edge, I think that's all that really matters for them. But everything else is just boxes checked galore for Ruben Bain. He practices hard. He plays hard. I think he's going to interview well. He's got the production. He's got the tape. It's an immediate turn the card in. I think, honestly, regardless of what they do in free agency, he's probably going to be the best player available if he's there. But that's enough about Ruben Bain. There's other players as well. Pons, the cornerback from Indiana, someone that I was introduced to, got the shout out from Mike Hilton, of all people, who's, about the same size, about 5'9", 180 pounds, but plays a lot larger than that. Really phenomenal in coverage, really tenacious as a tackler, takes on contact like it's no problem. He did get blocked by Miami's left tackle, who's, I think, as big as Orlando Brown Jr., and it was kind of comical to see, but that's not really a situation which he's going to win. So, a lot of exciting prospects to watch from Monday's championship game, but Ruben Bain Jr., yeah, that was basically like Bengals fans being, hey, yeah, this guy's for real. And they should probably draft him if they can. Let's get to some questions here. I mean, we just kind of talked about it, Lindsey Brill. Who do you think the Bengals will pick? This is, we're still in January. I think if Bain is there, he's going to be up atop the board if he's still available at the 10th overall pick. Because at that point, you have to imagine that other pass rushers are off the board. Caleb Downs is probably still there, but if he's not, he's probably in the conversation as well. Miami's right tackle played really well as well. I think he's among the top 2 tackles in this class, along with Spencer Fano from Utah. I think offensive tackle can honestly be in the conversation too, considering that they don't have any depth behind Amarius Mims and Orlando Brown Jr. Orlando Brown Jr. is a free agent in 2027. I think that's a worthwhile conversation to have when you're talking about a premium draft pick. And if an offensive tackle is the best player on the board, that's a conversation that needs to be had. But pass rusher, Peter Woods, probably the best defensive tackle in this class. He's probably going to be there. I think people have seen him slide down into the teens in some of these latest mock drafts. And honestly, the mock drafts that you see now in January, before all these interviews happen, before the combine happens, before athleticism data gets thrown into the equation, when people start, quote unquote, rising and falling up these boards, the boards right now are more or less set, and everything that happens beyond here in the pre-draft process, this is just teams confirming information. This is the time where people just confirm what they think they know. And sometimes they find out things and players, quote unquote, drop, but it's really just teams already having questions on some of these guys and then learning if those questions have any weight behind it. So if Peter Woods is now projected to go in the teens, that's probably where his range is going to end up, unless, again, he explodes at the combine. If these guys prove to be undeniable athletes, right, and they confirm some of these things on tape, then people are like, okay, now, like, you need to basically take this guy earlier than you expect. But pass rusher, maybe a cornerback, maybe if he's best player available, offensive tackle. I think all of those are on the table along with Caleb Downs. Let's see what else here. Could Troy Walters be a consideration for offensive coordinator? I think that Troy should have gotten OC looks by other teams for years now. You know, he was a really good coach for Nebraska. I want to say before he came to the Bengals, he was a part of that Indianapolis Colts offense as like a complimentary receiver behind the likes of Reggie Wayne in like the 2000s with Peyton Manning. So he's been around some really smart minds on offense, and obviously he's maximized who T. Higgins and Jamar Chase is. I think you would have liked to see more development from guys like Charlie Jones, and God, I mean, I'm not going to pin Jermaine Burton on him, but no, the Bengals have naturally developed a lot of receivers over the past handful of years. Mitchell Tinsley is probably the most recent one, right? A guy who was nothing for the Commanders a couple of years ago, and then all of a sudden signs as a street free agent and develops into a roster-worthy player. And I think a lot of that is attributed to Troy Walters. So in an era still where wide receiver is the second or third highest paid position in the league, there's a lot of value in having a guy that can develop players like that. And Troy Walters, I believe, at least a couple of years ago, he was heavily involved in the Bengals red zone package. I don't know if that role has grown or diminished since then. This was like a couple of years ago when we first heard about this. But he does so that does lend to the fact that he could eventually call plays, I think. And obviously he's been around this scheme and knows what works and what doesn't for a long time. So yeah, I think he is probably second under Cragthorpe in terms of who would be the internal promotion to OC, but I really would like to see Troy get some opportunities or at least some interviews in the coming years. I think that he's deserved it, and yeah, I think that would be a good story to have. But I think that's going to do it for now. We've been going for a little over 30 minutes, really dragged on about the whole damn pitcher situation, which again, it could be a bunch about nothing, right? He's going to interview with Tampa Bay, and honestly, he's probably one of their best candidates. And if I were Tampa Bay and I were looking to, squeeze the last juice of Baker Mayfield that I could before I have to find another quarterback, then I would definitely be interested in Dan Pitcher. I think he would do great in a full-time role as a play caller. And again, if the Bengals are doing this, then they must have confidence in what the next step is, because I don't think losing him is a good idea, regardless if he calls the plays or not. Apparently, according to Joe Goodberry, Dan Pitcher did call an entire game in 2025. We don't know which one, but it's something that I don't think that Zach is truly along the lines of like, I want to do this and like I have to do this, right? I don't know if it comes from the front office and how they want him to be the play caller to make sure that they don't lose their play caller if their offense is still good. But whatever the case may be, Dan Pitcher does deserve that opportunity, and it's good. In general, it's good that he is getting that opportunity. But if he does take it, then it's probably going to be Brian Callahan, and you just have to hope that the success from 2021 to 22 come back with a defense that is coached by someone else. Obviously, Al Golden over Lou Arumo. But that's the story for the Bengals in the next week or so. We'll find out more about that ongoing situation, and if either Callahan comes back, Pitcher stays, both are gone, who knows? We'll be here to cover on Z Sports Cincinnati. Take care, guys.